I love myself. There was a time in my life when the idea of loving myself seemed like a distant dream. I wasn't sure how to begin or even if I deserved it. I'd spent so much of my life seeking validation from others, hoping that their acceptance would somehow fill the empty space I felt inside. But it never quite worked. No matter how much praise or approval I received, it always felt temporary, like a fleeting moment of relief before the self-doubt returned. It took years for me to realize that the love I was looking for couldn't come from anyone else. It had to come from me. The beginning of doubt. My journey towards self-love began in the unlikeliest of places. A moment of complete despair. I had always been a high achiever. Someone who pushed myself to the limit in everything I did: school, work, friendships, even in trying to be the perfect version of myself. But despite all the effort I put into being the best I could be, I never felt like it was enough. There was always someone doing better, someone who seemed happier, more confident, more loved. I was constantly comparing myself to others, measuring my worth by their success and happiness. The moment that changed everything came during a particularly difficult period in my life. I was overwhelmed with responsibilities at work, struggling to keep up with my personal relationships, and feeling utterly drained. My inner critic was louder than ever, telling me I wasn't doing enough, that I wasn't enough. I began to believe it. I felt like I was failing in every area of my life. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I broke down. The weight of all the expectations I had placed on myself, combined with the pressure I felt from others, was too much. I couldn't keep up the facade anymore. I was exhausted from pretending to be strong, pretending to have it all together. In that moment, I realized something profound. I had been living my life based on what I thought other people wanted from me, not what I needed or wanted for myself. I had been so focused on trying to please everyone else that I had completely neglected my own needs. I didn't even know what loving myself looked like because I had never truly tried. The first step, recognizing the problem. After that breakdown, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep going the way I had been. But change didn't come easily. I had spent so many years building up a version of myself that was centered around external validation that I didn't know how to break free from it. I had to start by recognizing the harmful patterns I had fallen into. One of the biggest realizations I had was that my self-worth had become completely dependent on what others thought of me. Whether it was my boss's approval, my friends' praise, or the admiration of people I barely knew, I had allowed these external factors to dictate how I felt about myself. If someone complimented me, I felt good for a little while. But if I received criticism or even indifference, my confidence would plummet. It was a vicious cycle, and I knew it had to stop. I couldn't keep living my life based on the opinions of others. I needed to find a way to love myself independently of what anyone else thought. Learning self-compassion. The first step in my journey towards self-love was learning self-compassion. Up until that point, I had been my harshest critic. I expected perfection from myself in everything I did, and when I inevitably fell short, I would beat myself up for it. I would replay my mistakes over and over in my head, berating myself for not being smarter, more capable, or more successful. But through therapy and self-reflection, I began to understand the importance of being kind to myself. I realized that I was human, and humans are inherently flawed. We all make mistakes. We all have moments of weakness. And we all have things we wish we could do better. But that doesn't mean we're not worthy of love and compassion. I started to practice self-compassion in small ways. When I made a mistake at work, instead of dwelling on it for days, I would remind myself that it was okay to mess up sometimes. When I felt overwhelmed by my responsibilities, I would give myself permission to take a break, to rest, and to recharge without feeling guilty about it. This shift in mindset didn't happen overnight. It took time, and there were still plenty of moments when my inner critic would try to take over. But slowly, I began to replace that harsh, judgmental voice with one that was gentler and more understanding. reframing my self-worth. As I learned to be kinder to myself, I also started to reevaluate where I was placing my self-worth. For so long, I had believed that my value as a person was tied to my achievements and how others perceived me. But the truth is, our worth isn't something that can be measured by external accomplishments or the opinions of others. I began to explore the idea that my worth was inherent, that I was valuable simply because I existed. This was a radical concept for me at first, and I struggled to believe it. But over time, I realized that self-worth comes from within. It's about recognizing and accepting who you are, flaws and all, and knowing that you are enough just as you are. I started to focus on the qualities that made me uniquely me. I wasn't perfect, but I had a lot to offer. I was kind, empathetic, and creative. I had a passion for learning and a deep sense of curiosity about the world. These were the things that made me valuable, not how much I accomplished or what others thought of me. Setting boundaries. Part of learning to love myself also meant setting boundaries, something I had always struggled with. I was a people pleaser by nature, constantly putting others' needs before my own. I would say yes to things I didn't really want to do, or overextend myself in an effort to make everyone happy. But as I began to love myself more, I realized that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was necessary. If I wanted to protect my mental and emotional health, I had to be okay with saying no sometimes. I had to prioritize my own well-being over the desire to be liked by everyone. At first, this was incredibly difficult. I worried that people would be upset with me or think less of me if I didn't always agree to their requests. But as I started to set boundaries, I found that most people were understanding. And even if they weren't, I learned that their reactions were not my responsibility. Setting boundaries allowed me to take control of my time and energy. It gave me the space I needed to focus on myself and the things that truly mattered to me. And as I became more comfortable with saying no, I found that I had more room in my life for the things that brought me joy and fulfillment. Embracing my flaws. Another important lesson in my journey toward self-love was learning to embrace my flaws. For most of my life, I had tried to hide the parts of myself that I didn't like. I would downplay my insecurities, avoid talking about my struggles, and present a version of myself that I thought was more acceptable to others. But the truth is, no one is perfect. We all have flaws, and pretending that we don't only leads to more pain and frustration. As I worked on loving myself, I began to embrace the things that made me imperfect. I started to see my flaws not as something to be ashamed of, but as part of what made me human. I had quirks, insecurities, and struggles just like everyone else, and that was okay. In fact, it was those very things that made me unique. One of the most powerful moments in my journey came when I realized that the people I loved the most were not perfect. I didn't love them in spite of their flaws. I loved them because of them. Their imperfections were what made them real, and I began to see that the same was true for me. Cultivating gratitude. As I continued to work on loving myself, I also began to cultivate gratitude for the things I had in my life. I realized that part of my struggle with self-love had come from constantly focusing on what I lacked, rather than appreciating what I already had. I started a daily gratitude practice, where I would write down a few things I was grateful for each day. Some days it was something small, like a warm cup of coffee or a kind word from a friend. Other days, it was something bigger, like a personal accomplishment or a meaningful connection with someone I cared about. This practice helped me shift my mindset from one of scarcity to one of abundance. Instead of constantly seeking more success, more validation, more approval, I began to appreciate the richness of my life as it was. And as I did, I found that I had more love to give, not just to myself, but to others as well. Finding joy in the present. Perhaps one of the most important lessons I learned on my journey to self-love was the importance of being present. For so long, I had been focused on the future, on achieving the next goal, reaching the next milestone, or earning the next bit of approval. But in doing so, I had missed out on the beauty of the present moment. I began to practice mindfulness, paying attention to the here and now rather than constantly worrying about what was next. I learned to savor the simple joys of life,